Sarah Martinez had always been different from other women in the military. At 28 years old, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that came from surviving the toughest training the Navy had to offer. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a regulation bun, and her uniform was pressed to perfection. But underneath her long sleeves, hidden from the world, was a tattoo that told a story few would believe. The trident tattoo on her left shoulder was more than just ink on skin. It was proof of her membership in one of the most elite fighting forces in the world, the Navy SEALs. Sarah was among the first women to successfully complete the grueling training program that broke most men. She had endured months of physical and mental torture, crawled through mud under live fire, and proven herself worthy of wearing the trident. But now, stationed at a joint military base in Virginia, Sarah found herself in a very different kind of battle. The base was old-fashioned, run by officers who still believed that women belonged in support roles, not combat positions. When Sarah arrived with her transfer papers, she expected some resistance. What she didn't expect was to be completely ignored and dismissed. Colonel James Hartwell was the kind of officer who had served for 30 years without ever changing his mind about anything. He had gray hair, a permanent scowl, and believed that the military was no place for women in combat roles. When he first met Sarah, he barely looked at her file. He saw a young woman and immediately decided she would be best suited for administrative duties. Martinez, he had said on her first day, not bothering to look up from his paperwork, "You'll be working in the logistics department. We need someone to handle supply orders and coordinate meal services for visiting officials." Sarah had tried to speak up. "Sir, with respect, my background is in special operations. I believe I could be more useful in a different capacity." Colonel Hartwell finally looked up, his eyes cold and dismissive. "Miss Martinez, I've been running this base for 8 years. I know where people belong. You'll report to Lieutenant Stevens in logistics." That was 3 months ago, and since then Sarah had been treated like nothing more than a glorified secretary. Despite her protests and attempts to show her qualifications, she was assigned to tasks that had nothing to do with her training or abilities. She organized supply inventories, scheduled maintenance appointments, and worst of all, coordinated catering for official meetings. Lieutenant Stevens, who supervised the logistics department, was not much better than the colonel. He was a man in his 40s who had never seen combat, but acted like he was a war hero. He seemed to take pleasure in giving Sarah the most mundane tasks possible. "Martinez, we need you to make sure the conference room is set up for the quarterly review meeting," he would say with a smirk. "And don't forget to arrange for lunch to be brought in. The brass likes their sandwiches cut diagonally." Sarah bit her tongue and did the work. She had learned long ago that sometimes you had to pick your battles carefully, but inside she was burning with frustration. She had trained alongside the toughest warriors in the world, had jumped out of planes behind enemy lines, and had saved lives in combat situations that most people couldn't even imagine. Now she was cutting sandwiches and arranging flowers for meetings. The other enlisted personnel on the base seemed to sense that Sarah was different, but they couldn't quite figure out what it was. She moved with a grace and awareness that spoke of serious training. When she walked, she seemed to be constantly scanning her environment, as if she was still on a mission. Her physical fitness was obviously superior to most of the people on the base, but she never showed off or drew attention to herself. Some of the younger soldiers tried to ask her about her background, but Sarah had learned to be careful about what she shared. The Navy SEAL program was still so new for women that most people either didn't believe it or didn't understand it. She had faced enough skepticism and hostility already, without advertising her background to everyone. During her off-duty hours, Sarah kept to herself mostly. She would go to the gym early in the morning before most people were awake, maintaining the intense physical condition that her training required. She would run 10 miles like it was a casual jog, then spend an hour doing exercises that would leave most people exhausted. But the thing that frustrated Sarah the most was the waste of her skills and training. She read intelligence reports about operations happening around the world, missions where her expertise could make a difference. Instead, she was stuck on a base where her biggest challenge was making sure there were enough coffee cups for a meeting. The irony was not lost on her that she had fought harder to be accepted in the SEALs than any man ever had to, only to find herself in a position where her gender was once again being used to limit her opportunities. She had proven herself in ways that most people never would, but here she was, being treated like she was incapable of anything more challenging than office work. Sarah knew that eventually, something would have to give. She was too good at what she did to be wasted in this way forever, but for now she endured the daily humiliations and waited for her chance to show what she was really capable of. She kept her tattoo hidden and her mouth shut, but her time was coming. The military had taught her patience along with everything else. She would wait, and when the moment was right, she would remind everyone exactly who Sarah Martinez really was. As weeks turned into months, the situation at the base only got worse for Sarah. What had started as simple dismissal of her abilities had evolved into something more deliberate and cruel. It seemed like Colonel Hartwell and Lieutenant Stevens had made it their personal mission to remind her daily that they considered her nothing more than a servant in uniform. The morning started like any other, with Sarah arriving early to check on supply deliveries and coordinate the day's activities. She had just finished reviewing the inventory reports when Lieutenant Stevens walked into her small office with a stack of papers and his usual condescending smile. "Martinez, I hope you're ready for a busy day," he said, dropping the papers on her desk without ceremony. "We've got a surprise inspection from the Pentagon next week, and guess who gets to make sure everything is perfect?" Sarah looked up from her computer. "Sir, I assume the entire logistics team will be involved in preparation for such an important visit?" Stevens laughed in a way that made Sarah's jaw clench. "Oh no, Martinez. This is way too important to trust to the whole team. You're going to handle the VIP arrangements personally. Hotel reservations, transportation, meal planning, entertainment, the works. Sir, with respect, coordinating a Pentagon inspection involves security protocols and operational planning that would typically fall under—" "Martinez," Stevens cut her off sharply. "I didn't ask for your opinion on protocol. I gave you an assignment, unless you're telling me you're not capable of handling it." Sarah felt the familiar burn of frustration in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm capable of handling any assignment, sir. I was simply suggesting that my background might be better utilized in security planning rather than party planning." "Your background?" Stevens raised an eyebrow mockingly. "Martinez, your background is in office management and supply coordination. That's what your file says, and that's what you're qualified for. Now, are you going to handle this assignment, or do I need to report to the colonel that you're being insubordinate?" Sarah knew that arguing further would only make things worse. She had learned that Colonel Hartwell had a zero-tolerance policy for what he called attitude problems from female personnel. 3 women had been transferred off the base in the past year for supposedly being difficult to work with. "I'll handle the arrangements, sir," Sarah said quietly. "Good. And Martinez, make sure everything is absolutely perfect. The Pentagon brass doesn't tolerate mistakes, and neither do I." After Stevens left, Sarah stared at the stack of papers on her desk. The inspection was being led by General Patricia Morrison, a 3-star general who was known throughout the military for her no-nonsense approach and high standards. Sarah had actually heard Morrison speak at a conference years ago and had great respect for her. The irony that she would be reduced to planning flower arrangements for such an accomplished officer was not lost on her. As Sarah began working through the requirements, she discovered that the inspection was even more extensive than Stevens had indicated. General Morrison would be accompanied by a full team of Pentagon officials, and they would be conducting a comprehensive review of base operations, security protocols, and personnel readiness. Sarah realized that this was exactly the kind of evaluation where her real background could be invaluable. She understood operational security, personnel assessment, and combat readiness in ways that most logistics personnel never would. She could provide insights that might actually help the base pass the inspection with flying colors. But when she tried to suggest this to Stevens later that afternoon, he shut her down immediately. "Martinez, I don't know where you get these ideas about your qualifications, but let me make something very clear. You are not qualified to advise on operational matters. Your job is to make sure the general's coffee is hot and her lunch is served on time. That's it." The dismissal was so complete and so insulting that Sarah felt something snap inside her. She had endured months of being underutilized, of having her abilities ignored, of being treated like she was incompetent. But this was different. This was about the success of the entire base, and Stevens was too proud and narrow-minded to accept help that could make a real difference. That evening, Sarah sat in her small quarters and stared at her reflection in the mirror. She reached up and touched her shoulder where the trident tattoo lay hidden beneath her shirt. She thought about the day she had earned that tattoo, about the months of training that had nearly killed her, about the missions where she had proven herself alongside the best warriors in the world. She thought about her SEAL teammates who trusted her with their lives, who had seen her in action and knew what she was capable of. She thought about the enemies she had faced down, the impossible odds she had overcome, the barriers she had broken. And then she thought about Stevens smirking at her while he handed her flower arrangement catalogs and told her to make sure the general's lunch was nice and pretty. Sarah made a decision that night. She would do her job perfectly just as she always did. She would plan every detail of the general's visit with the same precision and attention to detail that she brought to combat missions. But she would also be ready for her moment. If the opportunity arose to show who she really was and what she was really capable of, she would take it. She had been patient long enough. She had played by their rules and accepted their limitations. But if they wanted to put her in charge of the general's visit, then they were going to get exactly what they asked for, and maybe more than they bargained for. The next morning, Sarah began planning the visit with a level of thoroughness that surprised even her. She researched every detail of General Morrison's background, her preferences, her schedule. She coordinated with security, transportation, and catering with military precision. If Stevens and Hartwell wanted her to prove herself through party planning, then she would plan a visit so flawless that even they would have to take notice. But more importantly, she would be ready when the moment came to step out of the shadows and remind everyone who Sarah Martinez really was. The week leading up to General Morrison's arrival was a whirlwind of activity that pushed Sarah to her limits, but not in the way her superiors intended. While they thought they were overwhelming her with menial tasks, Sarah was actually in her element. She approached the inspection preparation with the same systematic precision she had used to plan special operations missions. Every morning, Sarah arrived at the base before dawn to review her progress and plan the day's activities. She had created detailed timelines, backup plans, and contingency protocols for every aspect of the general's visit. When the catering company tried to change the menu at the last minute, Sarah had alternative vendors ready to go. When the transportation coordinator called in sick, Sarah seamlessly took over those responsibilities as well. But despite her obvious competence and efficiency, Stevens and Hartwell seemed determined to treat her like an incompetent subordinate. Every suggestion she made was dismissed, every improvement she proposed was rejected, and every success she achieved was attributed to their superior leadership. Martinez seems to be handling the basic arrangements adequately, Colonel Hartwell told Stevens during one of their daily briefings. But we need to make sure she doesn't try to overstep her bounds. Women in her position sometimes get ideas above their station when given a little responsibility. Stevens nodded enthusiastically. Don't worry, sir. I'm keeping a close eye on her. She tried to suggest some changes to the security protocols, but I shut that down immediately. She needs to stick to what she knows, coffee and sandwiches. What they didn't realize was that Sarah's suggestions about security protocols came from a deeper understanding of operational security than anyone else on the base possessed. She had noticed several potential vulnerabilities in their plans that could create real problems during the inspection, but when she tried to address these concerns, she was told to focus on her real job. The situation reached a new low 3 days before the inspection, when Major Williams, the base's protocol officer, decided that Sarah needed additional training to handle such an important visit. Martinez, Major Williams announced when he arrived at her office uninvited, "I've been reviewing your preparations, and I'm concerned that you might not understand the proper protocols for hosting distinguished visitors." Sarah looked up from the detailed briefing documents she had been preparing. "Sir, I've coordinated several high-level visits during my career. I'm confident in my understanding of proper protocols." Major Williams laughed dismissively. "Martinez, arranging coffee service for visiting contractors is hardly the same thing as hosting a 3-star general. This is way above your pay grade." He then proceeded to spend 2 hours explaining basic etiquette and protocol rules that Sarah had mastered years ago during her advanced training. She sat quietly and listened, occasionally saying "yes, sir," or "I understand, sir," while internally calculating, How many different ways she could disable Major Williams if this were a combat situation. The most humiliating part came when Major Williams decided to quiz her on proper serving procedures. Now, Martinez, when you're serving coffee to the general, you approach from the left side, correct? Actually, sir, proper military protocol dictates approaching distinguished guests from the right side, with the service item held in the left hand to allow for saluting with the right hand if necessary. Major Williams frowned, clearly annoyed that she had corrected him. Well, yes, that's technically correct. But in informal settings, sir, with respect, there are no informal settings when serving a 3-star general during an official inspection. The major's face reddened. Martinez, I don't appreciate being corrected by junior personnel. Perhaps you need a reminder about proper military courtesy. My apologies, sir. I was simply trying to ensure that we follow correct protocol for the general's visit. Major Williams spent another hour lecturing her about knowing her place and respecting the chain of command. By the time he left, Sarah was gripping her pen so tightly that she had nearly snapped it in half. That evening, Sarah called her former SEAL teammate Marcus Chen, who was now stationed in California. She needed to talk to someone who understood what she was really capable of, someone who had seen her in action. Marcus, I'm going crazy here, she said after explaining her situation. They've got me planning dinner menus for a general who I could probably protect better than her entire security detail. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Sarah, I remember when you took down that entire terrorist cell in Afghanistan with nothing but a knife and a radio. And these idiots have you worried about which fork goes where. It's not about the work itself, Sarah explained. It's about being completely invisible. They look at me and see nothing but limitations. They have no idea what I've done or what I'm capable of. You know what, Sarah? Maybe it's time they found out. What do you mean? I mean, maybe this inspection is your chance to remind everyone who you really are. Not by telling them, but by showing them. After hanging up, Sarah thought about Marcus's words. She had been so focused on enduring the disrespect and waiting for a better assignment that she had forgotten her own advice to young SEALs. Sometimes you don't wait for permission to be excellent. Sometimes you just have to show people what excellence looks like. The next morning, Sarah decided to add some elements to the inspection visit that went beyond Stephen's limited vision. She couldn't change her official role, but she could certainly excel at it in ways that might get noticed by someone who mattered. She researched General Morrison's military career in detail and discovered that the general had a particular interest in innovative approaches to military efficiency and personnel utilization. Sarah began incorporating subtle elements into the visit that would showcase the base's potential, rather than just its current state. When Stevens reviewed her final preparations, he was pleased with what he saw as proper subservience. Good work, Martinez. You've finally learned to focus on your actual job instead of trying to be something you're not. Sarah smiled politely. Thank you, sir. I think the general's visit is going to be very educational for everyone involved. Stevens completely missed the double meaning in her words. He had no idea that Sarah was about to turn his carefully controlled inspection into something much more interesting than he had planned. The stage was set. General Morrison would arrive the next day, and Sarah would finally have her opportunity to show what she was really made of. She just had to be patient for one more day. General Patricia Morrison arrived at the base exactly on schedule, stepping out of her staff car with the bearing of someone who had spent 30 years earning every star on her collar. She was a woman in her 50s with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, sharp eyes that missed nothing, and a reputation for cutting through military bureaucracy like a laser through paper. Sarah watched from across the parking lot as Colonel Hartwell and his senior staff rushed to greet the general. Even from a distance, she could see the nervous energy radiating from the officers who usually acted so confident and commanding. The presence of real authority had a way of exposing people's insecurities. The morning portion of the inspection went smoothly. General Morrison toured the facilities, reviewed operational reports, and conducted interviews with key personnel. Sarah remained in the background, ensuring that every logistical detail was handled perfectly. When the general's aide mentioned that they were running ahead of schedule, Sarah had backup activities ready to go. When a piece of audio equipment malfunctioned during a briefing, Sarah had replacement equipment set up within minutes. But despite her obvious competence, none of the senior officers acknowledged her contributions. In fact, they seemed to go out of their way to minimize her presence whenever the general was nearby. Martinez, make sure you stay in the background, Lieutenant Stevens had whispered to her before the morning briefings. The general doesn't need to be bothered with logistics personnel. As lunchtime approached, Sarah made her final preparations in the officers' dining room. She had arranged for a catered meal that reflected both the general's dietary preferences and the base's commitment to supporting local businesses. The presentation was flawless, the timing was perfect, and every detail had been considered. General Morrison entered the dining room with Colonel Hartwell and his senior staff. Sarah positioned herself near the serving area, ready to ensure that everything went smoothly. The general took her seat at the head of the table, and the conversation immediately turned to operational matters. General Morrison, Colonel Hartwell began, clearly trying to impress her. I think you'll find that our base operates with exceptional efficiency. We've streamlined our operations and eliminated unnecessary personnel in key positions. Interesting, the general replied, her tone neutral. Tell me more about your personnel utilization strategies. Major Williams jumped in eagerly. We've found that by properly assigning personnel based on their natural capabilities, we've improved overall productivity. Everyone has their place and we make sure they stay in it. Sarah felt her jaw tighten as she listened to the conversation. They were essentially bragging to General Morrison about their discriminatory practices while she stood 10 feet away, serving their lunch. Lieutenant Stevens noticed that the general's water glass was nearly empty and decided to demonstrate his management style. Martinez, he called out loudly, the general needs water. Sarah moved smoothly to refill the general's glass, her movements precise and professional. As she leaned forward to pour the water, her sleeve rode up slightly, exposing just the edge of her tattoo. General Morrison glanced up as Sarah served her water, and her eyes caught sight of the partial tattoo. The general's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a slight furrowing of her brow as if she was trying to place something familiar. Thank you, General Morrison said to Sarah directly, looking at her with sudden interest. You're welcome, ma'am, Sarah replied, automatically tugging her sleeve back down, but it was too late. General Morrison had seen enough of the tattoo to recognize what it was, and her sharp mind was already putting pieces together. The woman serving lunch moved like a trained warrior, had the bearing of someone accustomed to command, and was wearing what appeared to be a Navy SEAL trident tattoo. Colonel Hartwell, oblivious to what had just happened, continued his presentation. As I was saying, General, we believe in utilizing our personnel according to their strengths. Take Martinez here, for example. She's perfect for support roles, organizing, serving, maintaining. That's where women really excel in the military. General Morrison's eyes never left Sarah as the colonel spoke. I see. And what's Martinez's background? Oh, basic administration and logistics, Lieutenant Stevens answered quickly. Nothing too complicated. She handles supply orders, coordinates catering, that sort of thing. Interesting, General Morrison said quietly, still watching Sarah. Martinez, could you step forward for a moment? Sarah felt her heart rate increase, but she maintained her composure as she approached the table. Colonel Hartwell looked confused and slightly annoyed that the general was addressing his serving staff directly. Martinez, General Morrison said carefully, that's an interesting tattoo on your arm. Could you tell me about it? The room fell completely silent. Sarah could feel the eyes of every officer at the table boring into her. She glanced at Colonel Hartwell, whose face was turning red with embarrassment, that his logistics coordinator was being questioned about personal matters during an official lunch. Sarah took a deep breath. She had been hiding her true identity for months, enduring disrespect and discrimination from officers who assumed they knew who she was, based on their own prejudices. But General Morrison had asked her a direct question, and Sarah had never lied to a superior officer in her life. Ma'am, it's a Navy SEAL trident, Sarah said clearly, her voice carrying across the silent room. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Lieutenant Stevens choked on his coffee. Major Williams dropped his fork with a clatter. Colonel Hartwell's mouth fell open in shock. A Navy SEAL trident, General Morrison repeated, her voice growing stronger. And how does one earn a Navy SEAL trident, Martinez? Sarah straightened to attention instinctively. By successfully completing basic underwater demolition SEAL training, ma'am. FUD Class 234. General Morrison stood up slowly, her eyes never leaving Sarah's face. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as the general's expression grew harder. "So let me understand this correctly," General Morrison said, her voice dangerously quiet. "You're telling me that Petty Officer Martinez here is a Navy SEAL, and you have her serving lunch?" Colonel Hartwell stammered, trying to recover from his shock. "General, There must be some mistake. Martinez's file clearly shows—" "What does her file show, Colonel?" General Morrison's voice cut through his explanation like a blade. The colonel fumbled with papers, his confidence completely shattered. Sarah watched as months of dismissal and disrespect suddenly hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. General Morrison turned back to Sarah. "Martinez, how long have you been assigned to this base?" "3 months, ma'am." "And what have your duties consisted of during those 3 months?" Sarah hesitated for just a moment, glancing at her superiors. But General Morrison's authority was absolute, and Sarah answered honestly. "Logistics coordination, supply ordering, and event planning, ma'am." The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone in the room knew that something fundamental had just shifted, and there would be no going back. General Morrison remained standing, her presence filling the room with an authority that made even the senior officers shrink back in their chairs. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before she spoke again, her voice carrying the weight of 3 decades of military leadership. "Colonel Hartwell," she said, each word measured and deliberate, "would you please explain to me how a Navy SEAL ended up serving lunch at your base?" Colonel Hartwell's face had gone from red to pale white. He shuffled through papers desperately, trying to find Sarah's personnel file. "General, there must be some kind of administrative error. The file I have shows Martinez as logistics personnel with basic administrative training." General Morrison's eyes narrowed. "Martinez, what was your previous assignment before coming to this base?" Sarah glanced once more at Colonel Hartwell, who was staring at her with a mixture of shock and growing horror. "Ma'am, I was part of SEAL Team 3 stationed in Norfolk. My last deployment was a counterterrorism operation in Afghanistan." The general turned back to the colonel, her expression growing more dangerous by the second. "Afghanistan, counterterrorism, and you have her planning dinner parties." Lieutenant Stevens tried to interject, his voice shaky. "General, with all due respect, we had no knowledge of any special operations background. If there was an error in the paperwork—" "Enough!" General Morrison's voice cut through his excuses like a whip crack. "Martinez, tell me exactly what happened when you reported to this base." Sarah felt a mixture of vindication and nervousness as she prepared to tell the truth. "Ma'am, I reported to Colonel Hartwell with my full service record and requested assignment to security operations or training positions appropriate to my background. I was assigned to logistics without review of my qualifications." "Without review," General Morrison repeated slowly. "Colonel, is it your standard practice to assign personnel without reviewing their qualifications?" Colonel Hartwell was sweating now, his carefully maintained authority crumbling. "General, we review all personnel assignments based on base needs and individual capabilities. Sometimes there are operational requirements that supersede." "What operational requirements would supersede utilizing a Navy SEAL in an appropriate capacity?" The general's voice was rising now, and Sarah could see why she had earned a reputation for not tolerating incompetence. Major Williams made the mistake of trying to defend the decision. "General, with respect, we felt that Martinez would be more suitable for support roles. Given certain factors, we thought it would be better to—" "What factors?" General Morrison's question was sharp and immediate. Major Williams realized too late that he had walked into a trap. He glanced desperately at Colonel Hartwell, who was now staring at his hands and offering no help. We felt that her skill set was better suited to administrative functions." "Her skill set," General Morrison said, her voice dripping with contempt. "The skill set that includes advanced combat training, weapons expertise, tactical planning, and counterterrorism operations. That skill set was better suited to arranging flowers and serving coffee." Sarah watched in fascination as the power dynamic in the room completely reversed. These officers, who had spent months treating her like she was invisible, were now squirming under the scrutiny of someone who actually understood her value. "General." Morrison walked around the table until she was standing directly in front of Sarah. "Martinez, during your time at this base, did you ever attempt to inform your superiors about your qualifications?" "Yes, ma'am. Multiple times." "And what was their response?" Sarah hesitated. She had endured months of humiliation, but speaking against her superiors to a general was serious business. However, General Morrison had asked a direct question, and Sarah had never been one to back down from the truth. "Ma'am, I was told that my background was irrelevant and that I should focus on tasks more appropriate to what they felt were my natural capabilities." The room was so quiet that Sarah could hear the air conditioning humming. General Morrison's expression had moved beyond anger into something much more dangerous, cold, calculated displeasure. "Natural capabilities," the general repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Colonel Hartwell, would you care to explain what you meant by natural capabilities?" Colonel Hartwell looked like a man watching his career disintegrate in real time. "General, I never said anything about natural capabilities. I simply made assignments based on what I felt were the best interests of the base." "The best interests of the base," General Morrison said, turning back to face the table full of officers. "Let me tell you, gentlemen, what the best interests of the base actually require. They require utilizing every asset to its maximum potential. They require making decisions based on qualifications, not prejudices, and they certainly require treating highly trained personnel with the respect they've earned." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "Martinez, how many combat deployments have you completed?" "7, ma'am. 7 combat deployments. And how many of you gentlemen have completed 7 combat deployments?" General Morrison looked around the table. No hands were raised. "How many of you have completed SEAL training?" Again, silence. "How many of you have participated in counterterrorism operations behind enemy lines?" The officers stared at their plates, none willing to meet her eyes. General Morrison turned back to Sarah. "Martinez, what was your last fitness test score?" "Perfect score, ma'am. As required for active SEALs, perfect score." "Colonel Hartwell, what was your last fitness test score?" The colonel mumbled something inaudible. "I'm sorry, I didn't catch that." "Barely passing, ma'am," he said louder, his humiliation complete. General Morrison nodded slowly. "So we have a situation where the most qualified, most experienced, and most physically capable person on this base has been relegated to serving lunch to people who couldn't last a day in her boots." She walked back to her chair but remained standing. "Gentlemen, I've seen a lot of things in my 30 years of service, but this level of mismanagement and waste of resources is beyond anything I've encountered." Lieutenant Stevens made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "General, if we had known about Martinez's background, of course we would have utilized her differently. This is clearly just a paperwork error that we can correct immediately." General Morrison's laugh was cold and bitter. "A paperwork error? Is that what we're calling it? Martinez, show me your tattoo." Sarah looked around the room uncertainly. General Morrison's tone brooked no argument, so Sarah rolled up her left sleeve, revealing the full Navy SEAL trident tattoo on her shoulder. "Gentlemen, this tattoo is not hidden under layers of clothing. Any competent officer should have noticed it during routine interactions. But more importantly, any competent officer should have reviewed her personnel file thoroughly enough to understand what they were dealing with." The general sat down heavily, her anger now mixed with profound disappointment. The real tragedy here isn't just the waste of Martinez's talents. It's what this reveals about the leadership of this base. You made assumptions based on prejudice rather than facts. You ignored qualifications in favor of preconceived notions, and you created an environment where one of our most valuable assets was treated like a servant. Sarah felt a mixture of vindication and sadness as she watched her superiors being systematically dismantled by someone who actually understood military excellence. She had dreamed of this moment for months, but seeing it happen was both satisfying and deeply troubling. How many other qualified people were being wasted because of similar assumptions? General Morrison looked directly at Sarah. "Martinez, effective immediately, you're reassigned to my staff for the remainder of this inspection. I want a full briefing on the security vulnerabilities you've identified and your recommendations for improvement." Sarah snapped to attention. "Yes, ma'am." The general then turned back to the shocked officers. "As for the rest of you, we'll be having a very different kind of inspection than originally planned. I want to see every personnel file, every assignment decision, and every policy that led to this situation." The room erupted in nervous murmurs as the officers realized that their careers were now hanging in the balance. Sarah allowed herself a small smile as she finally stepped out of the shadows and into the role she had earned through blood, sweat, and determination. The real inspection was just beginning. 3 hours later, Sarah found herself in the base commander's office, but this time she was sitting at the conference table instead of serving coffee. General Morrison had completely restructured the inspection, and Sarah was now providing the security briefing she had been preparing for months in her head. As you can see from the perimeter assessment, Sarah explained, pointing to the detailed diagram she had prepared, there are 3 critical vulnerabilities in our current security posture that could be exploited during a coordinated attack. General Morrison studied the diagrams with the attention of someone who understood operational security at the highest levels. These are excellent observations, Martinez. How long did it take you to identify these issues? I noticed them within the first week of my assignment, ma'am. I attempted to bring them to the attention of my supervisors, but was told that security matters were outside my purview. The general made notes in her file. And you've been thinking about solutions for 3 months while arranging lunch meetings. Yes, ma'am. I also identified several opportunities for improved training protocols and personnel efficiency that could significantly enhance our operational readiness. General Morrison leaned back in her chair. Martinez, I'm going to be direct with you. What happened here is unacceptable, and there will be consequences, but I want to know how you want to handle your own situation going forward. Sarah had been thinking about this question since the moment her tattoo was discovered. Ma'am, I'd like to continue serving in a capacity that utilizes my training and experience. I didn't become a SEAL to prove a point about gender equality. I became a SEAL because I believe in serving my country to the best of my abilities. And what about your treatment here? Are you planning to file formal complaints? Sarah considered this carefully. General, I'm more interested in making sure this doesn't happen to others than I am in punishing people who made mistakes. If we can use this situation to improve policies and training, that would be more valuable than any individual justice. General Morrison smiled for the first time since the lunch incident. That's exactly the kind of thinking I'd expect from someone with your background. Leadership isn't about revenge, it's about making things better. Over the next 2 days, General Morrison conducted the most thorough inspection in the base's history. She reviewed every personnel file, interviewed dozens of service members, and examined policies and procedures with forensic detail. What she found was a pattern of mismanagement that went far beyond Sarah's situation. Several other qualified personnel had been underutilized based on assumptions about their capabilities. A former Army Ranger had been assigned to kitchen duty because he was quiet and officers assumed he lacked leadership potential. A female pilot with combat experience had been relegated to administrative duties because her commanding officer felt that women were too emotional for flight operations during peacetime. The investigation also revealed that Colonel Hartwell had been systematically rejecting transfer requests and promotion recommendations for personnel he deemed unsuitable for advancement, which disproportionately affected women and minorities. On the final day of her visit, General Morrison called a base-wide assembly. Sarah stood with the general's staff, wearing her proper rank insignia for the first time in months. The entire base population was present, from the newest recruits to the senior officers who had spent the week watching their authority crumble. Ladies and gentlemen, General Morrison began, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. This inspection has revealed some serious issues with personnel management and leadership on this base. I want to address these issues directly and publicly. She paused, making eye contact with people throughout the crowd. The United States military is the finest fighting force in the world because we are committed to excellence, merit, and utilizing every asset to its maximum potential. When we fail to live up to these standards, we not only waste resources, we undermine the very principles we've sworn to defend. Sarah watched as the general's words sank in. She could see understanding dawning on the faces of some of the younger service members, who were realizing that the treatment they had witnessed wasn't normal or acceptable. Effective immediately, there will be significant changes to the leadership and policies of this base. Colonel Hartwell, Lieutenant Stevens, and Major Williams are being relieved of their current positions pending further review. A new command structure will be established with leaders who understand that competence, not prejudice, should determine assignments. The crowd stirred as the news sank in. Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions as she watched her former tormentors learning their fate. She took no pleasure in their downfall, but she was relieved that other people wouldn't have to endure what she had experienced. Furthermore, General Morrison continued, Petty Officer Martinez will be assigned as the new base security coordinator. a position that properly utilizes her expertise and experience. She will be working directly with Pentagon security advisors to implement improved protocols based on her recommendations. The applause that followed was genuine and enthusiastic. Sarah realized that many of the base personnel had suspected that something was wrong with her assignment, but hadn't felt empowered to speak up. Now they were seeing that excellence and qualification mattered more than politics and prejudice. After the assembly, Sarah was approached by several service members who had their own stories of being undervalued or misassigned. A young Marine corporal told her about being passed over for leadership training because his commanding officer thought he was too bookish. A Navy communications specialist shared how she had been excluded from important meetings because officers assumed she wouldn't understand the technical aspects. "Ma'am," the communications specialist said to Sarah, "seeing you stand up there today, it gives me hope that things can actually change." Sarah smiled. "Things don't change automatically. They change because people like us keep proving what we're capable of, even when others can't see it." 6 months later, Sarah received a letter from General Morrison, who had been promoted to 4-star rank and was now overseeing military personnel policies at the Pentagon. The letter informed Sarah that her recommendations had been implemented at bases across the country, and that new training programs had been developed to help commanders recognize and utilize the full potential of their personnel. Letter also mentioned that Sarah had been selected for promotion and was being considered for assignment to an elite joint task force that was being formed to address emerging security threats. Sarah folded the letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer next to a photo from her SEAL training graduation. She thought about the long journey from that proud moment to the months of humiliation, and finally to this new opportunity to serve at the highest levels. She had learned that sometimes the greatest battles weren't fought with weapons on foreign battlefields, but with patience and determination against ignorance and prejudice in unexpected places. The tattoo on her shoulder had always represented her commitment to excellence and service. Now it also represented the power of truth to eventually overcome assumption, and the importance of never giving up on showing people who you really are. As Sarah prepared for her next assignment, she made a promise to herself that she would never forget the lesson of those difficult months. Excellence and character weren't always immediately recognized, but they were always worth fighting for. And sometimes the most important victories came not from defeating enemies, but from helping allies see possibilities they had never imagined. The lunch that changed everything had become the catalyst for systemic change that would affect countless service members for years to come. Sarah's hidden tattoo had finally told its story, and that story was just beginning.